Still, the kitchen light hummed as my daughter, who I raised alone after her mother died, told me to serve her husband or leave my own house. As I smiled and reached for my suitcase, I kept my hands steady, the way I used to when she was scared as a child. While that light buzzed above us, her husband watched in silence, already standing where he thought I used to belong. The same buzzing followed me down the hallway, counting every sacrifice I'd made so she'd never depend on a man like him. That's when I realized I wasn't being kicked out. I was being erased as her father to make room for her husband. Still, as the light vanished behind the door, I took what no son-in-law survives losing: the truth he built his life on. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Megan didn't raise her voice when she said it. That was the part that hurt the most. No shouting, no tears, just a flat, practiced calm that felt rehearsed, like she'd already said the words a dozen times in her head before letting them land. "Dad, things are different now," she said, standing near the kitchen island, arms crossed, eyes steady. "Greg is the head of this household. You either respect that or you find somewhere else to live." Rick Davies stood across from her, 67 years of restraint settling heavily in his chest. The house around them was quiet in that polished, suburban way, expensive silence, padded by high ceilings and carefully chosen furniture. He had paid for most of it, built the rest of it with years of quiet discipline and sacrifice. And now, in his own home, he felt like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Greg didn't say a word. He leaned against the doorway, one shoulder pressed to the frame, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't loud arrogance. It was worse. It was satisfaction, the kind that comes when someone finally believes they've won without having to lift a finger. Rick looked at his son-in-law then. Greg met his gaze without flinching. There was no respect there, no gratitude, just relief that the balance of power had finally tipped in his favor. Rick felt the insult fully. It landed deep, heavy, unmistakable. But he didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He didn't remind Megan of who had paid Greg's first business loan, or whose name still carried weight on accounts Greg didn't fully understand. Rick had learned long ago that raising your voice only made weak people feel strong. Instead, he nodded once. "All right," Rick said quietly. Megan blinked, as if she had expected resistance. Greg straightened slightly, disappointed that there would be no confrontation to enjoy. Rick turned and walked down the hallway toward his bedroom. Each step felt deliberate, measured. The walls were lined with family photos, vacations, birthdays, smiling moments frozen in time. He didn't stop to look at them. He already knew what they showed. What they didn't show was how easily love could be rewritten as inconvenience. In the bedroom, Rick opened the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. He packed slowly. A few shirts, basic necessities, nothing sentimental. He moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had made hard decisions before and survived them. Then he reached higher, toward the back of the closet, where a narrow shelf sat just out of casual reach. From there, he took down an old, locked document folder. It was scuffed, the leather cracked at the edges. He hadn't opened it in years. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was inside: records, agreements, original documents from a time when his signature still meant something, when he still controlled the foundation beneath everything Greg now enjoyed. Rick held it for a moment longer than necessary, feeling its weight. Not heavy in pounds, heavy in consequence. When he walked back into the living room, suitcase in one hand, folder tucked under his arm, Megan's composure finally cracked. "So that's it?" she snapped. "You're just leaving? You're really going to abandon us over this?" Rick stopped near the front door and turned to face her. He studied his daughter's face, the familiar features, the unfamiliar hardness. He wondered when she had learned to mistake control for leadership and silence for weakness. "I'm not abandoning anyone," Rick said evenly. "I'm respecting your decision." Greg chuckled under his breath. "You're being dramatic, Rick." Rick didn't look at him. He looked at Megan. "You chose how this would go. I'm simply not standing in the way." Megan opened her mouth, then closed it again. Whatever she had expected, pleading, anger, guilt, this wasn't it. Rick saw the uncertainty flicker in her eyes, just for a second. He turned the doorknob. As he stepped outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway. The air felt lighter, colder, honest. Rick didn't slam the door. He didn't pause for a final two-word. He walked to his car, placed the suitcase in the trunk, and slid into the driver's seat with the same calm he had carried all his life. As he pulled away from the house he had built, Rick didn't feel defeated. I felt awake, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and the quiet ache, something else began to take shape, slow, deliberate, and patient. Our reckoning had just begun. The apartment was smaller than anything Rick Davies had lived in for decades. One bedroom, thin walls, a narrow balcony overlooking a parking lot that smelled faintly of oil and hot asphalt. It wasn't miserable, but it was stripped of pretense. No gates, no manicured hedges, no quiet symbols of success humming in the background. Rick set his suitcase down beside the bed and stood still for a moment, listening. The silence here was different, honest. It didn't belong to anyone else. That first night, sleep came in fragments. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, watching memories surface uninvited. Long nights early in his career. Missed birthdays he'd justified as temporary. The years after his wife passed, when he'd swallowed grief and poured himself into work so his daughters would never feel instability. Everything he had built, every safety net had been for them. And now, he was alone in a rented box, because his own daughter had decided he was excess weight. In the morning, Rick made coffee with the same methodical care he always had. He shaved. He dressed neatly, even though there was nowhere to go. Discipline, he reminded himself, was not situational. It was survival. His phone buzzed mid-morning. A message from Megan. "We need to talk about finances." Another followed seconds later. "Greg says you still have access to some accounts. That needs to be fixed." Then another. "This doesn't have to get ugly, Dad." Rick stared at the screen, feeling something inside him harden. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. There was no, "Are you okay?" No. "Did you find a place?" Just logistics. Control. Pressure. He set the phone face down and finished his coffee. Days settled into a quiet rhythm. Morning walks. Simple meals. Evenings spent reading or reviewing old papers he'd brought with him, the locked folder now resting on the small kitchen table like a patient witness. Rick hadn't opened it yet. He didn't need to rush. Rushing was how people made mistakes. On the third evening, he spread out additional files he'd stored digitally years ago. Old spreadsheets, archived reports. Things Greg had never bothered to look at closely, because Greg had never built anything from scratch. Rick's eyes narrowed as he traced columns of numbers with a pen. Something was off. At first, it was subtle. Transfers that didn't align with stated expenses. Timing mismatches. Amounts rounded too cleanly, too frequently. Rick leaned back in his chair, heart steady but alert. He recalculated figures in his head, then again on paper. The discrepancies didn't disappear. They multiplied. Rick pulled another file, then another. Patterns began to emerge, not chaos, but intent. Money moved in ways designed to look ordinary at a glance, the kind of maneuvering that relied on people assuming the older man had stopped paying attention. A faint, humorless smile touched Rick's face. His phone buzzed again. "Greg needs you to sign off on a correction," Megan texted. "It's just paperwork." Rick didn't respond. He sat there until the light outside faded, the apartment dim except for the glow of his laptop. For the first time since leaving the house, the weight in his chest shifted not lighter, but sharper. Focused. They hadn't just pushed him out. They had assumed he was finished. Rick thought about how Megan had stood there, arms crossed, rehearsed, and certain. About Greg's silence. His confidence built on the idea that Rick's dignity was the same thing as weakness. They were wrong. Rick closed the files carefully and stacked them neatly. Silence, he understood now, wasn't retreat. It was cover. It was space to observe, to calculate, to let other people reveal exactly how far they were willing to go. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping on a name he hadn't spoken to in years. He didn't call yet. Not tonight. Tonight was for confirmation. Rick locked the folder, slid it back into his bag, and turned off the light. In the dark, his thoughts were clear, precise. They had taken his home. They had not taken his mind. And if the numbers were telling the truth, as they almost always did, then Greg Collins had made a mistake far bigger than disrespect. Rick lay back on the bed, already planning his next move, knowing one thing with certainty. This time, silence would work for him. Rick worked late into the night. The small apartment lit by a single lamp and the dull glow of his laptop. Outside, traffic passed in low, distant waves. But inside, his focus narrowed to rows of numbers that refused to behave the way honest numbers should. He rebuilt the ledgers from scratch. Greg's versions were polished, clean categories, neat summaries, confidence baked into every spreadsheet. But when Rick traced the transactions back to their origins, the story changed. Transfers that hopped between accounts without purpose. Consulting fees paid to shell entities that produced nothing. Short-term loans disguised as operating costs. The math didn't scream incompetence. It whispered desperation. Greg wasn't just skimming. He was bleeding. Rick leaned back, rubbing his eyes, then leaned forward again. He cross-checked dates against cash flow statements. Large withdrawals preceded by rushed approvals. Funds shifted just before quarterly reviews. It was the kind of behavior Rick had seen before, years ago, when men tried to outrun losses instead of admitting them. Greg was upside down, deeply, and worse, he was hiding it. Rick's jaw tightened as another realization settled in. Several of the questionable accounts still bore Rick's name, not as an active manager, but as a legacy guarantor, a symbol, a shield. Greg had been trading on Rick's reputation, using his credibility to buy time, to quiet banks, to reassure partners who would have never trusted Greg alone. The insult was no longer personal. It was operational. Rick's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. "Megan, we need help," the message read. No greeting, no context. Another followed. "Just temporarily, until things stabilize." Rick stared at the screen. He felt the familiar tug, the instinct to protect, to absorb impact so his children wouldn't have to. That instinct had guided most of his life. It had also made him predictable. He typed a reply, deleted it, set the phone down. There was no apology in her words, no acknowledgement of how she had forced him out, just expectation. As if support was automatic, as if the past week hadn't happened. Rick returned to the files. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that Greg's situation wasn't salvageable with a simple infusion of cash. This wasn't a rough quarter. It was structural rot. Lies layered over lies, each one requiring a bigger lie to keep it standing. And Rick's name was propping up the whole collapsing frame. He closed the laptop slowly. This was no longer a family dispute. It wasn't even just fraud. It was exposure, legal, financial, reputational. If Greg went down loudly, Rick would be dragged into the narrative whether he wanted to be or not. Unless he moved first. Rick opened his contacts and scrolled again, stopping at the name he had hovered over the night before. Karen Miller. They had crossed paths years ago during a consulting case that had turned criminal. Karen had been sharp, then methodical, patient, uninterested in theatrics. She had also been fair. Rick respected that. He didn't call immediately. Instead, he drafted a short email. No accusations, no conclusions, just facts, irregularities, documents, a quiet request for a confidential conversation. He attached only a fraction of what he had uncovered. Then he sent it. Rick sat back, letting the air leave his lungs slowly. For the first time since Megan's ultimatum, a flicker of grief surfaced, not for what he had lost, but for what his daughter had chosen to protect. Greg's recklessness, Greg's pride, Greg's illusion of control. The phone buzzed again. "Dad," Megan wrote, "we really need you right now." Rick picked up the phone, read the message once, and set it face down on the table. He wasn't angry. Not yet. What he felt was resolve. This situation was bigger than hurt feelings, bigger than disrespect. Greg had crossed into territory where good intentions only made things worse. Rick knew that world. He had spent his career cleaning up after men who thought charm could outpace consequences. He wouldn't be one of their enablers. Rick gathered the files, locking the folder with deliberate care. He placed it back into his bag, then sat in the quiet apartment, waiting not anxiously, but patiently. If Karen Miller confirmed what Rick already suspected, then this would stop being a private reckoning. It would become a formal one. And once that door opened, there would be no way to close it again. He didn't arrive angry. He didn't arrive unannounced. He showed up on a quiet afternoon, when the house was calm and the tension hadn't yet been stirred by raised voices or defensive rehearsals. Greg was in the living room, laptop open, one leg crossed over the other like a man certain of his footing. Megan was nearby, scrolling through her phone. Rick stood across from them, posture relaxed, hands empty, no folder, no documents, Just a few printed pages folded neatly in his jacket pocket, enough to suggest awareness, not enough to reveal depth. "I've been reviewing some old accounts," Rick said evenly. "There are transfers I don't recognize." Greg didn't even look surprised. He leaned back, smirked, and let out a short laugh. "You're still digging through that stuff?" he said. "Rick, no offense, but this isn't your era anymore. Systems change. You wouldn't understand how things work now." Megan looked up immediately. "Greg knows what he's doing, Dad," she said, her tone sharp with impatience. "You don't need to insert yourself into everything." Rick met her eyes. He saw no hesitation there, just alignment. Sides chosen. "I'm not inserting myself," Rick replied calmly. "My name is still attached to several of these accounts." Greg waved a dismissive hand. "That's just legacy structure. It reassures people. Completely standard." Rick nodded slowly, as if considering the explanation. "Standard structures don't usually involve money circling back through shell entities." Greg's smile tightened. For a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, something flickered behind his eyes. Then he recovered. "You're reaching," Greg said. "Honestly, this feels like you're just having trouble letting go. Happens to a lot of men your age." The word age landed exactly where Greg intended it to. Megan crossed her arms. "Dad, you're embarrassing yourself," she said. "If there's an issue, Greg will handle it. This is his responsibility now." Rick absorbed the moment fully. The mockery, the dismissal, the way his concern had been reframed as interference. He understood something then with absolute clarity. This conversation would go nowhere. Direct confrontation wasn't just useless, it was ammunition. Every question he asked would teach Greg where to hide next. Every concern he voiced would be twisted into proof that Rick was unstable, bitter, obsolete. Rick let the silence stretch. "All right," he said finally. Greg blinked. "All right?" Rick nodded. "I just wanted to be sure." Megan frowned, confused by the lack of resistance. Greg leaned forward slightly, searching Rick's face for something: anger, threat, desperation. He found none. Rick turned to leave. As he did, Olivia stepped into the room. She had been quiet until now, watching from the hallway. Her eyes moved from Rick to Greg, then to Megan. "What was that about?" she asked softly. "Nothing," Megan said too quickly. "Dad's just worried." Olivia didn't look convinced. "About what?" Greg smiled at her, smooth and reassuring. "Accounting noise," he said. "Boring stuff." Olivia nodded slowly, but her gaze lingered on Rick as he walked past her. There was a question there, not accusation. Curiosity. Rick caught it. He didn't stop. He didn't explain. But he gave her a brief look that said more than words ever could. "Pay attention." That night, Rick sat alone in his apartment, replaying the exchange. Greg's confidence hadn't been the confidence of innocence. It had been the confidence of someone who believed he controlled the board. Rick opened his notebook and wrote down everything Greg had dismissed. Every deflection, every insult disguised as humor. Patterns mattered. People revealed themselves when they thought they were winning. Across town, Olivia sat at her own desk, pulling up shared accounts she'd never bothered to question before. She remembered Greg's tone, the way he'd laughed too quickly. Rick didn't know that yet. What he did know was this: the power in that house had shifted, even if no one else recognized it. Greg thought he had forced Rick into retreat. In reality, Rick had stepped out of sight. And from that distance, from silence, from patience, a structure began to take shape. Not emotional, not impulsive, legal, measured, unavoidable. Rick closed his notebook and turned off the light, fully aware that the next time Greg felt confident enough to laugh, it would be because he hadn't yet seen the trap forming beneath his feet. Rick discovered the document by accident, or what would have been an accident for someone less attentive. He was cross-referencing authorization logs late one night when a scanned PDF caught his eye. It was old, buried deep in a subfolder Greg had labeled Legacy Approvals. Rick opened it, expecting routine language. Instead, he froze. His signature sat at the bottom of the page. Clean, confident, perfectly placed, and completely fake. Rick stared at it for a long moment, studying the curves, the pressure points, the slight flourish at the end of his last name. It was a good forgery, not rushed, practiced. Someone had studied how his hand moved, how he signed when he wasn't thinking. Slowly, Rick scrolled. The document authorized a transfer he had never approved, one that funneled money into an overseas holding company. He checked the date, then another file, then another. His chest tightened, not with shock, but with a deep, controlled anger that settled behind his ribs. This wasn't a single lapse. It was a system. Rick spent the next 2 days doing nothing else. He mapped timelines, compared signatures, matched approvals against travel records that proved he hadn't even been in the country for some of them. The pattern stretched back years, quiet, consistent, intentional. Greg hadn't just taken advantage of Rick's trust. He had manufactured it. Offshore accounts surfaced next. The kind buried under layers of corporate fog, routed through jurisdictions designed to exhaust anyone who tried to follow the trail. Funds siphoned slowly, then accelerated. Hidden cushions, emergency exits. Greg hadn't been planning to fail. He'd been planning to escape. Rick sat back in his chair, feeling the final illusion dissolve. This wasn't about ambition or insecurity. It was premeditated betrayal, carried out patiently under the assumption that Rick would never look closely enough to matter. His phone buzzed. Megan. This time, she didn't bother with politeness. "You've caused a mess," she said the moment Rick answered. "Banks are asking questions." Greg stressed. "Everything was stable before you started digging." Rick listened without interrupting. "You walked out," she continued. "You don't get to come back now and tear things apart just because you're angry." "I'm not angry," Rick said quietly. "Well, someone is," Megan snapped. "And it's ruining our lives." There it was. Not concern, not curiosity. Blame. "You should have trusted us," she added. "Instead, you're destroying stability." Rick felt the familiar grief surface soft, aching, old. The grief of realizing that his daughter saw order where there was theft, loyalty where there was deception, that she preferred the comfort of illusion to the discomfort of truth. "I didn't destroy anything," Rick said evenly. "I uncovered it." Megan hung up. That night, Rick invited Olivia over. She arrived cautious, confused, clearly aware that something was wrong, but unsure of the shape of it. They sat at the small kitchen table in Rick's apartment, the locked folder between them. Rick didn't soften the truth. He showed her the documents, the signatures, the transfers. He explained the pattern without drama, without exaggeration, just facts, cause and effect. Olivia's face drained of color as she read. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached the forged signature. "That's not yours," she whispered. "No," Rick said. "It's not." She looked up at him, eyes shining not with anger, but with heartbreak. "Megan knows?" "She knows what Greg tells her," Rick replied, "and what she needs to believe." Across town, Greg felt the shift. Calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back with neutral, legal phrasing. Partners who had once laughed easily now asked for confirmations in writing. His name, once buoyed by Rick's reputation, felt suddenly exposed. Paranoia crept in. Greg began double-checking doors, refreshing inboxes compulsively, replaying conversations in his head, searching for leaks. The confidence he had worn so comfortably now felt thin, brittle. Rick watched all of it from a distance. He didn't confront. He didn't accuse. He didn't warn. He understood now that noise only gave predators time to adapt. Silence, when paired with precision, left them nowhere to hide. Rick locked the folder one final time and placed it in his bag. This wasn't about revenge fueled by rage. It was about ending something cleanly, completely. And when Rick finally moved, it would be without announcement, silent, decisive, and impossible to undo. There was no dramatic phone call, no righteous speech, just a quiet meeting in a neutral office, where facts mattered more than feelings. The man Rick chose was thorough, unflinching, and unimpressed by reputation. He listened, asked precise questions, and didn't blink when Rick slid copies of the forged documents across the table. "This won't stay private," the accountant said after reviewing the initial material. "Once we start pulling threads, people will notice." Rick nodded. "That's fine." It was the first clear line he'd drawn since everything began. The accountant went to work immediately. Subpoenas were discussed, jurisdictions mapped, offshore pathways identified. What Rick had uncovered alone was only the surface. Beneath it lay a structure designed to survive casual scrutiny. Greg hadn't just stolen, he'd engineered insulation. And insulation only mattered when someone expected heat. Megan called that afternoon. Her voice was different this time, tighter, urgent. "Dad, please," she said. "We can still fix this quietly." Rick let her speak. He had learned the value of listening without interruption. "Greg made mistakes," she continued. "You know how business is. It doesn't have to become this. Lawyers, investigations, people will talk." Rick looked out the window of his apartment at the dull movement of traffic below. Ordinary lives, untouched by the mess he was standing in the center of. "Quietly fixing this means pretending it didn't happen," Rick said. "It means protecting the family," Megan shot back. "Protecting us." Rick closed his eyes briefly. "No," he replied. "It means protecting him." There was silence on the other end. "You're choosing strangers over your own daughter," Megan said finally, her voice cracking with anger. Rick felt the familiar pull the reflex, to soften, to repair, to absorb blame for the sake of peace. It had defined most of his life as a father, but peace built on denial was just another form of damage. "I'm choosing not to become complicit," Rick said. "I won't protect predators, not even if they married into my family." Megan hung up. Legal action followed swiftly after that. Carefully, methodically, Rick authorized the release of specific records. Nothing more than necessary, but enough to set processes in motion that could not be quietly reversed. Institutions moved slower than emotions, but when they moved, they carried weight. Letters were sent, questions were asked, and the walls began to crack. Olivia didn't stay silent. She showed up at Rick's apartment one evening with grocery bags and quiet resolve. "I told Megan I support you," she said as she unpacked food into the small kitchen. "She didn't take it well." Rick studied his younger daughter, seeing both fear and strength in her posture. "You don't owe me that," he said. "I owe myself the truth," Olivia replied. "And you're the only one telling it." Her support was simple but visible. She answered calls, she corrected rumors. When family friends reached out with carefully neutral questions, Olivia didn't hedge. "Yes," she said, "something is wrong. And no, my father didn't cause it." The family facade didn't collapse all at once. It peeled away. Neighbors noticed Greg's sudden absence from social events. Business acquaintances stopped returning his messages. A carefully maintained image, successful, controlled, untouchable, began to fray at the edges. People sensed instability long before they understood its source. Rick felt the cost of it keenly. He mourned the version of his family that had once existed, or at least the version he had believed in. But grief no longer dictated his actions. When Megan confronted him in person days later, her anger was raw. "You're blowing everything up," she accused. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" Rick met her gaze steadily. "Yes," he said. "And I know what they'll say if this goes unchallenged." She looked at him, then, not as a father, but as an obstacle. That realization hurt more than her words. But Rick didn't move. He had drawn his line. And as the pressure mounted, legal, social, financial, Rick remained exactly where he was, anchored by the same principle that had built everything Greg tried to steal. Some lines, once crossed, could not be erased, only enforced. And Rick was done stepping back. Greg was still in his robe, coffee untouched on the counter, when the sound cut through the house firm, official, impossible to ignore. By the time he reached the door, his confidence had already begun to leak away, replaced by a tight, brittle irritation. When he opened it, irritation collapsed into disbelief. Two officers stood on the porch, calm, prepared. Behind them, a marked car idled quietly, as if this were just another stop on a routine morning route. "Gregory Collins?" one of them asked. Greg glanced past them, scanning for cameras, for neighbors. The world seemed suddenly too exposed. "What's this about?" he demanded, trying to summon authority from habit. They didn't argue. They didn't explain beyond the necessary words. Financial fraud, forgery, interstate and international implications. Handcuffs clicked closed with a sound that carried far beyond the driveway. By noon, the story was everywhere. Local news first, then national outlets hungry for a clean narrative. Respected financial figure's son-in-law arrested in expanding fraud investigation. Photos of Greg carefully curated headshots from better days flashed across screens, paired with words like alleged and systematic and ongoing. The house felt smaller with every headline. Megan watched the coverage in stunned silence until it turned into something else, rage, sharp and directionless. By the time she stormed into Rick's apartment, her composure was gone. "This is your fault," she shouted, voice breaking. "You did this to him. To us." Rick stood as she paced the room, the small space amplifying her anger. "I didn't arrest Greg," he said evenly. "I didn't forge documents. I didn't move money offshore." "You didn't have to ruin him," Megan cried. "You could have handled this quietly, like a family." Rick felt the accusation press in on him, heavy with years of expectation. Fix it. Absorb it. Make it go away. He didn't. "I refuse to lie," Rick said. "If the truth ruins someone, the truth isn't the problem." Megan's face twisted. "He's being treated like a criminal." "He is one," Rick replied, not unkindly. That was when she broke. Not into tears, into fury. She accused Rick of betrayal, of pride, of choosing principle over blood. Each word landed, each one cutting in its own way. Rick listened until there was nothing left to say. "I won't carry your guilt," he told her quietly. "And I won't apologize for refusing to be complicit." She left without another word, the door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the walls. Across peace. It had defined most of his life as a father, but peace built on denial was just another form of damage. "I'm choosing not to become complicit," Rick said. "I won't protect predators, not even if they married into my family." Megan hung up. Legal action followed swiftly after that. Carefully, methodically, Rick authorized the release of specific records. Nothing more than necessary, but enough to set processes in motion that could not be quietly reversed. Institutions moved slower than emotions, but when they moved, they carried weight. Letters were sent, questions were asked, and the walls began to crack. Olivia didn't stay silent. She showed up at Rick's apartment one evening with grocery bags and quiet resolve. "I told Megan I support you," she said as she unpacked food into the small kitchen. "She didn't take it well." Rick studied his younger daughter, seeing both fear and strength in her posture. "You don't owe me that," he said. "I owe myself the truth," Olivia replied. "And you're the only one telling it." Her support was simple but visible. She answered calls, she corrected rumors. When family friends reached out with carefully neutral questions, Olivia didn't hedge. "Yes," she said, "something is wrong. And no, my father didn't cause it." The family facade didn't collapse all at once. It peeled away. Neighbors noticed Greg's sudden absence from social events. Business acquaintances stopped returning his messages. A carefully maintained image, successful, controlled, untouchable, began to fray at the edges. People sensed instability long before they understood its source. Rick felt the cost of it keenly. He mourned the version of his family that had once existed, or at least the version he had believed in. But grief no longer dictated his actions. When Megan confronted him in person days later, her anger was raw. "You're blowing everything up," she accused. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" Rick met her gaze steadily. "Yes," he said. "And I know what they'll say if this goes unchallenged." She looked at him, then, not as a father, but as an obstacle. That realization hurt more than her words. But Rick didn't move. He had drawn his line. And as the pressure mounted, legal, social, financial, Rick remained exactly where he was, anchored by the same principle that had built everything Greg tried to steal. Some lines, once crossed, could not be erased, only enforced. And Rick was done stepping back. Greg was still in his robe, coffee untouched on the counter, when the sound cut through the house firm, official, impossible to ignore. By the time he reached the door, his confidence had already begun to leak away, replaced by a tight, brittle irritation. When he opened it, irritation collapsed into disbelief. Two officers stood on the porch, calm, prepared. Behind them, a marked car idled quietly, as if this were just another stop on a routine morning route. "Gregory Collins?" one of them asked. Greg glanced past them, scanning for cameras, for neighbors. The world seemed suddenly too exposed. "What's this about?" he demanded, trying to summon authority from habit. They didn't argue. They didn't explain beyond the necessary words. Financial fraud, forgery, interstate and international implications. Handcuffs clicked closed with a sound that carried far beyond the driveway. By noon, the story was everywhere. Local news first, then national outlets hungry for a clean narrative. Respected financial figure's son-in-law arrested in expanding fraud investigation. Photos of Greg, carefully curated headshots from better days flashed across screens, paired with words like alleged and systematic and ongoing. The house felt smaller with every headline. Megan watched the coverage in stunned silence until it turned into something else, rage, sharp and directionless. By the time she stormed into Rick's apartment, her composure was gone. "This is your fault," she shouted, voice breaking. "You did this to him. To us." Rick stood as she paced the room, the small space amplifying her anger. "I didn't arrest Greg," he said evenly. "I didn't forge documents. I didn't move money offshore." "You didn't have to ruin him," Megan cried. "You could have handled this quietly, like a family." Rick felt the accusation press in on him, heavy with years of expectation. Fix it. Absorb it. Make it go away. He didn't. "I refuse to lie," Rick said. "If the truth ruins someone, the truth isn't the problem." Megan's face twisted. "He's being treated like a criminal." "He is one," Rick replied, not unkindly. That was when she broke. Not into tears, into fury. She accused Rick of betrayal, of pride, of choosing principle over blood. Each word landed, each one cutting in its own way. Rick listened until there was nothing left to say. "I won't carry your guilt," he told her quietly. "And I won't apologize for refusing to be complicit." She left without another word, the door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the walls. Across T, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Balance. Whatever came next, he would meet it grounded not as the man who lost his family, but as the man who finally understood which bonds were worth carrying forward. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It rippled. Greg's arrest had been the stone thrown into the water, but the waves reached farther than anyone expected. Within days, subpoenas landed on desks across the city. Offices that once welcomed Greg with open doors suddenly returned calls through lawyers. Deals stalled. Accounts were flagged. People who had stood comfortably in his shadow began scrambling for light. One by one, Greg's partners started to fall. Some claimed ignorance. Others blamed bad advice. A few tried to disappear quietly, hoping distance would erase association. But the paper trail didn't care about excuses. It followed money, and money always remembered where it had been. Tom Sanders cracked first. Rick learned about it from Detective Miller, who called one afternoon with her usual restrained efficiency. "Sanders came in this morning," she said. "Full cooperation. Documents. Statements. He's protecting himself." Rick closed his eyes briefly. Tom had always been nervous, the kind of man who smiled too quickly and drank too much at company dinners. Rick had noticed it years ago and filed it away, the way he filed away most things. "What did he give you?" Rick asked. "Enough to widen the net," Miller replied. Greg wasn't alone. He just thought he was insulated. Rick thanked her and ended the call, feeling no satisfaction, only inevitability. Across town, Megan's world was shrinking fast. Greg's frozen assets meant bills she'd never paid attention to were suddenly her problem. Credit cards declined. Accounts she assumed were secure revealed balances that made no sense. Friends who once called daily stopped reaching out. Invitations disappeared. Sympathy had an expiration date. She called Rick twice in 1 week. The first time, he didn't answer. The second time, he listened. "I just need help getting through this," Megan said, exhaustion cutting through her pride. "Just until things stabilize." Rick felt the old instinct stir the need to fix, to shield, to step in before things collapsed completely. He pictured Megan as a child, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for him to come home late from work. That memory still had power. But power wasn't permission. "I can't do that," Rick said gently. Silence followed. "You're really going to let me fail?" she asked. Rick chose his words carefully. "I'm going to let you face what's real." She hung up without saying goodbye. Rick didn't chase the call. Instead, something unexpected happened. With the chaos no longer consuming every thought, space opened up. Rick began waking earlier, not out of anxiety, but intention. He walked longer routes through the city, noticing things he'd rushed past for years. He accepted a lunch invitation from a former colleague he hadn't spoken to since retirement. Then another. People reached out not for money, not for leverage, but for conversation. Old clients who respected his integrity. Former peers who had watched quietly as his name was dragged into someone else's mess and wanted him to know they hadn't believed the worst. One of them offered him consulting work. Limited. Clean. On Rick's terms. Rick surprised himself by saying yes. He felt lighter moving through his days, not because the damage was undone, but because it was no longer hidden. Truth, once surfaced, demanded less effort to carry. Olivia noticed it too. "You seem freer," she said one evening as they shared dinner at his apartment. Rick smiled faintly. "I think I am." Unexpected allies continued to emerge: neighbors, professionals, even distant relatives who had kept their distance while Greg's influence loomed. Without that shadow, relationships recalibrated. Some fell away, others strengthened. Rick didn't miss the ones that vanished. For the first time in years, he felt no obligation to perform a role. No need to be the silent backstop, the financial gravity holding everyone else in orbit. He belonged only to himself and to the few who chose him without conditions. Late one night, Rick stood on his balcony. The city stretched out beneath him, imperfect and alive. He breathed deeply, feeling the quiet settle into his bones. Greg was still awaiting trial. Megan was still spiraling. The fallout was far from over. But Rick understood something now with calm certainty. What he was tasting wasn't revenge. It was freedom. And once felt, it was impossible to give back. The prison smelled like disinfectant and old air, the kind that stripped everything human down to procedure. Rick moved through security without hesitation, following painted lines on the floor, submitting to rules without comment. He wasn't there to prove anything. He wasn't there for closure. He was there to see clearly. Greg sat on the other side of the glass, thinner than Rick. Remembered, his confidence replaced by something restless and performative. He smiled when he saw Rick, the same practiced smile that had once disarmed investors and charmed rooms full of people who didn't look too closely. "Rick," Greg said, leaning toward the phone. "Didn't think you'd come." Rick picked up his receiver and said nothing. Greg filled the silence easily. "This whole thing's gotten out of hand," he said. "You know how these investigations work. They build narratives. Someone has to be the villain." Rick watched him carefully. Greg's eyes flicked, measuring, calculating, still hunting for leverage. "I always respected you," Greg continued. "You taught me a lot. That's why this hurts. If you talked to the right people, clarified a few things, this could ease up." Rick remained silent. Greg frowned slightly, then adjusted his tone. "Megan's not doing well," he added. "She needs stability. You could help with that. You always said family comes first." There it was. Rick finally spoke. "Family doesn't come first," he said calmly. "Integrity does." Greg laughed softly. "That's easy to say when you're not the one sitting in here." Rick met his gaze. "You're sitting there because of choices you made." The smile faded. "You think you're better than me?" Greg snapped. "You think because you stayed quiet all these years, you get to judge?" Rick leaned forward slightly. "No," he said. "I think you underestimated me. Same mistake you've made from the beginning." Greg stiffened. He searched Rick's face for anger, for triumph, for anything he could twist into an advantage. He found none. Rick stood, setting the receiver down gently. "I won't interfere," he said, "and I won't protect you. This is where my involvement ends." As Rick walked away, he felt no surge of satisfaction, just confirmation. Greg hadn't changed. Even now, he saw people as tools, situations as angles. The prison doors closed behind Rick with a final, echoing thud. That night, Megan called. Rick recognized the sound of tears before she spoke. Ragged, unguarded, stripped of the sharp edges she'd worn for months. "I don't know what to do," she said. "Everything's falling apart." Rick listened. He let the silence hold space instead of rushing to fill it. "I can't sleep," Megan whispered. "I'm scared all the time." Rick closed his eyes, feeling the ache return, not sharp, not explosive, but deep and familiar. This was the daughter he remembered, not the one who had delivered ultimatums, but the one who once needed him, simply to be steady. "I can't fix this for you," Rick said gently, "and I won't fund your way out of it." Megan sobbed softly. "So you're just done with me?" Rick chose his words with care. "I'm not done being your father, but I'm done rescuing you from consequences that aren't mine." She was quiet for a long moment. "What does that even mean?" she asked. "It means I'll listen," Rick said. "I'll show up honestly. But things change only if you're willing to face what happened, fully." Megan didn't answer right away. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted. Rick nodded to himself, though she couldn't see it. Then we take this one step at a time. No denial, no blame. The call ended without resolution. No apology, no promises. But something had shifted. Rick sat alone afterward, the apartment quiet around him, and felt the tension he'd carried for months begin to loosen. Not disappear, but loosen. Healing, he understood now, wasn't about returning to what had been. It was about setting terms for what could be. And for the first time, those terms were his. Whatever came next with Megan, with the family, with the fallout still unfolding, Rick would meet it grounded, unmoving. Not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as a man who had finally reclaimed the right to define peace. The quiet after the storm was unfamiliar. Rick moved through his days with a steadiness that felt earned, but not light. There were moments, small, unexpected ones, when the weight of what he'd lost pressed in on him. Passing a father and daughter laughing over coffee. Seeing an old family photo surface in a news article about the scandal. Grief didn't announce itself. It arrived softly, and it stayed. He mourned not just Megan, but the version of her he had believed in. The one who had once defended him instinctively. The one who hadn't yet learned how easily comfort could masquerade as loyalty. Megan, for her part, resisted change with quiet determination. Their conversations were brief and careful, circling the truth without landing on it. She spoke of stress, of embarrassment, of how unfair the public attention felt. She did not speak of Greg's choices. She did not speak of accountability. Rick listened without correcting her, without agreeing. The distance between them became its own language. Olivia refused to let that distance define everything. She spoke openly about redefining family, not as something inherited, but something chosen daily through action. She invited Rick into her routines, shared meals, casual moments without agenda. With her, Rick didn't feel like a man repairing damage. He felt like a father simply present. The public scandal showed no sign of slowing. Greg's name continued to cycle through headlines as new details emerged. Analysts speculated. Comment sections filled with judgment and misinformation. Rick's own past was dissected. His successes reframed through suspicion until official clarifications restored some balance. He stopped reading after a while. There was no value in watching strangers debate his life. Instead, Rick began planning his exit not from responsibility, but from proximity. The city had become saturated with reminders. Every familiar street corner carried an echo. He didn't want to disappear. He wanted space. A smaller city. Quieter. Somewhere he could walk without being recognized, where his history wouldn't precede him into every room. The idea brought relief. Around that time, a former client reached out. Someone Rick had helped years ago, quietly, without fanfare. The message was direct. I could use your mind again. Consulting. Clean work. No entanglements. Rick considered it carefully. He didn't need the money, but he wanted the work. Purpose, he'd learned, wasn't something you retired from. He accepted with conditions. Limited scope, full transparency, control over how his name was used. The agreement was signed without friction. It felt right. Rick informed Greg's attorney shortly after. Any remaining lines of communication were to cease. No visits, no calls, no indirect messages through Megan or anyone else. Greg's chapter in Rick's life was closed. Permanently. The decision brought no drama, just finality. That evening, Rick packed a few boxes, not everything, just enough to begin the process of letting go. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each item placed into cardboard was a boundary reinforced. Olivia helped, chatting lightly, grounding the moment. Family isn't a place, she said at one point. It's how safe you feel. Rick smiled. Then I think I finally understand it. Later, alone, Rick stood by the window, city lights flickering below. He felt the distance settle in, not as emptiness, but as clarity. Some things were beyond repair. Some people chose denial over growth. And some chapters ended not with closure, but with quiet resolve. Rick picked up his phone and deleted Greg's contact information for the last time. No ceremony, no anger, just a clean break. Whatever lay ahead, new work, new surroundings, uncertain healing with Megan, it would unfold without Greg's shadow. Rick turned off the light, knowing the distance he was creating wasn't avoidance. It was survival. And for the first time, survival felt like progress. The new city didn't announce itself with promise. It didn't try to impress. It simply existed: wider streets, fewer eyes, a slower rhythm that didn't demand explanations. Rick liked that immediately. He moved with intention, not urgency. A modest condo near a park, clean lines, neutral walls, nothing that carried history he hadn't chosen. On his first morning there, he walked the neighborhood before sunrise, the air cool and unclaimed. No one recognized him. No one cared who he used to be. It felt like oxygen. Work followed naturally. Rick rebuilt professionally the same way he rebuilt everything else, quietly, precisely, on his own terms. Consulting work came in measured pieces. He selected projects that required judgment, not ego. Companies didn't want his name for prestige. They wanted his mind for stability. Rick delivered both, without attachment. For the first time in years, he enjoyed the work without feeling owned by it. He cooked more, read more, learned the habits of the city, where to buy decent coffee, which streets stayed quiet at night, which benches caught the afternoon sun. Independence stopped feeling like isolation and started feeling like authorship. Then Megan called. Rick didn't answer immediately. He let the phone ring, watching it from across the room like an object that might still be dangerous if handled too quickly. When he finally picked up, her voice was subdued, careful, in a way it hadn't been before. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," she said. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I spoke to you, for pushing you out." Rick closed his eyes, listening not just to her words, but to the space between them. The apology was real but incomplete. It stopped short of Greg, short of responsibility, short of the deeper truth. "Thank you," Rick said. "I hear you." "That's it?" Megan asked, uncertainty leaking through. "That's where we are," Rick replied calmly. She hesitated. "I'm trying, Dad." Rick believed her. And still, belief wasn't the same as trust. After the call ended, he sat in silence, letting the emotion rise and settle without chasing it. Caution wasn't punishment. It was memory doing its job. Olivia visited a week later. She brought warmth with her, filling the condo with easy conversation and laughter. They walked the city together, shared meals, argued lightly about books and movies. With Olivia, nothing felt fragile. "This suits you," she said, standing on his balcony one evening, looking out over the park. "You seem solid." Rick nodded. "I feel earned." Her presence tested something in him, not fear, but balance. He could love without losing himself, support without surrendering control, family without submission. When Olivia left, Rick didn't feel the old ache of abandonment. He felt gratitude. The difference mattered. Megan called again days later, more tentative this time. She asked questions about the city, about his work, about how he was sleeping. Rick answered honestly, without overgiving. Each conversation became a small negotiation, not of power, but of pace. Trust, Rick knew, didn't return all at once. It showed up slowly, if at all. One evening, Rick stood in his new office space, a small room he'd converted with a desk by the window, shelves lined with only what he needed. He looked around and felt something settle fully for the first time since everything had fallen apart. Ownership, not of property, of direction. He hadn't escaped his life. He had edited it, chosen what stayed, chosen what didn't. Rick poured himself a drink and raised the glass, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. Starting over wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to be defined by it. Whatever happened next with Megan, with the family still reshaping itself, it would happen alongside his independence, not at its expense. Rick took a slow sip, watching the city lights come on one by one. This life was his, and no one would ever take it from him again. The past had a way of returning without invitation. Rick felt it one afternoon while sorting through mail, an envelope forwarded from his old address, handwriting instantly familiar. Megan's. His chest tightened before he even opened it. Some wounds didn't need words to reopen. She arrived 2 weeks later. No lawyers, no warnings, just Megan standing in the doorway of his condo, smaller somehow, her confidence dulled by exhaustion. She looked around as if cataloging the life he'd built without her, measuring what she no longer controlled. "I was in town," she said. "I thought maybe we could talk." Rick stepped aside and let her in. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same position they'd occupied so many times before, but everything else was different. Megan spoke first, her voice unsteady. "I keep thinking about how it got this far," she said. "I replay things. Wonder where I missed it." Rick listened, careful not to fill the space. He had learned that silence invited truth more reliably than confrontation. "I should have seen it," Megan continued. "But I was tired. I wanted things to be easy." Greg made them feel that way. Guilt pressed in on her words, raw and defensive at the same time. Rick felt it collide with his own instinct to protect, to soften the moment. Survival won. "You didn't just miss it," Rick said quietly. "You dismissed it." Megan flinched. "That doesn't mean you're beyond accountability," he continued. "But it does mean we can't pretend it was accidental." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't want to choose," she whispered. "I just wanted everything to stay normal." Rick nodded slowly. "Normal was already gone. You just decided not to look." The words were hard, but they were clean. Later that week, Rick began therapy. Not because he was breaking, but because he didn't want to carry unexamined weight into the rest of his life. The sessions were quiet, methodical. He spoke about his wife's death, about building security as a substitute for presence, about how being needed had slowly turned into being used. Naming it didn't absolve anyone. It clarified him. Megan visited again after his third session. This time, the conversation shifted. Less defense, more honesty. Pain surfaced on both sides, hers for feeling abandoned long before Rick had ever left the house. His for realizing how often love had been mistaken for control. "I thought if I kept everyone safe financially, it would be enough," Rick admitted. "I didn't see how it taught you to equate security with silence." Megan looked down, absorbing that. "I thought strength meant never questioning the person in charge." They sat with that shared failure, neither rushing to resolve it. Healing didn't announce itself with relief. It arrived awkwardly, in pauses, in moments where neither of them knew what to say next, but stayed anyway. Rick didn't offer forgiveness. Megan didn't ask for it. They acknowledged pain without trading it like currency. That was new. When Megan left that evening, there was no dramatic goodbye. Just an understanding that something fragile had shifted, not repaired, not complete, but alive. Rick stood alone afterward, feeling the exhaustion of honesty settle into his bones. It was heavier than anger, but it didn't corrode. Old wounds, he understood now, didn't heal by being ignored. They healed by being seen fully, without disguise. As Rick prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. "Proud of you." Rick smiled faintly, setting the phone aside. The past had resurfaced. It always would. But for the first time, it no longer dictated the future. Healing had begun not as a promise, but as a practice. And practice, Rick knew, was something he could commit to. The news reached Rick early in the morning, delivered without drama by a notification he almost ignored. Greg Collins, released on bail pending trial. Rick read it once, then set the phone down. No spike of fear, no rush of anger, just recognition. Some echoes took longer to fade. Megan's reaction was immediate. She called before Rick had finished his coffee, her voice tight with panic. "He's out," she said. "Greg's out. I don't know what he'll do." Rick listened, steady. He had expected this moment. "He wants to talk," Megan continued. "He keeps saying he needs to explain, that this is his chance to fix things." Rick looked out the window at the quiet street below, the city moving on as it always did. "He doesn't need to explain anything to me," Rick said, "and I'm not meeting him." "You can't just shut him out," Megan said. "He's still a grown man responsible for his choices," Rick finished. "And no longer my concern." The line went quiet. "I'm scared," Megan admitted softly. "He's angry. He blames everyone." Rick felt the old instinct stir again, the need to step in, to act as buffer between chaos and the people he loved. He let it rise, then pass. "Then you need to protect yourself," Rick said. "Not bring him back into your life through me." Later that day, Detective Miller called. "This changes the dynamic," she said. "He's under conditions, but men like him don't handle loss of control well. Be cautious." Rick appreciated her directness. "I will," he said. The warning didn't frighten him. It clarified his boundaries. Olivia called that evening, already informed. "You're not thinking of seeing him, right?" she asked. "No," Rick said. "That door's closed." "Good," Olivia replied, "because if he comes near you, I want to know." Rick smiled faintly. Her protectiveness didn't feel like reversal. It felt earned. Greg tried anyway. A message came through an unknown number. Short, familiar in tone. "We should talk." For closure. Rick read it once and deleted it without response. No explanation. No warning. No engagement. That silence was different now. It wasn't strategic. It was final. Rick understood something then that had taken him years to learn. Self-preservation wasn't selfishness. It was wisdom earned through pain. He rearranged his routine slightly, varied his routes, not out of fear, but awareness. He didn't shrink his life. He protected it. Megan called again days later, calmer but still unsettled. "He wants me to convince you," she said. "Says you owe him that." Rick exhaled slowly. "I don't owe him anything," he replied. "And neither do you." Olivia stood firm, refusing to carry messages, refusing to soften language. "He doesn't get access to us anymore," she told Megan. "That chapter's closed." Rick felt gratitude settle deep. The echo of Greg's presence lingered, not in Rick's mind, but in the spaces where chaos had once lived. And in those spaces, Rick placed something new. Boundaries. When night fell, Rick locked his door and stood for a moment in the quiet, listening not for danger, but for certainty. Greg was out on bail, but he was no longer inside Rick's life. Not his responsibility, not his problem, not his burden. Rick turned off the light, fully aware that choosing himself had finally become instinct. Whatever Greg did next would unfold without Rick's involvement, and that, Rick knew, was the real freedom. Greg disappeared quietly. No announcement, no dramatic escape. One day he was complying with bail conditions, checking in through lawyers and intermediaries, insisting he was preparing his defense. The next, his phone went dark. His rental was empty. Accounts that had been dormant for years suddenly showed coordinated movement. Money vanished. Detective Miller called Rick with the update, her voice controlled but tight around the edges. "He planned this well," she said. "Used funds we hadn't frozen yet, enough to start over somewhere else." Rick closed his eyes, not in surprise, but confirmation. "Where? We're tracing it. But he's gone." Megan didn't handle the news the way Rick did. She arrived at his condo unannounced that evening, her composure finally shattered. She looked smaller than ever, eyes red, hands shaking as she tried and failed to hold herself together. "He left me," she said, voice cracking. "He took everything and just left." Rick guided her to the couch and sat across from her, close enough to be present, far enough not to absorb the collapse for her. "I don't know what to do," Megan sobbed. "I defended him. I chose him, and he didn't even hesitate." Rick felt the grief surge then, not sharp, not angry, but deep and old. This was the moment he'd hoped she'd never have to experience, the truth arriving without buffer. "He showed you who he is," Rick said quietly. "Not today, not even recently. He's been showing you for years." Megan buried her face in her hands. "I ruined everything." Rick didn't correct her. He didn't soften it either. "You survived," he said. "That matters more than what you protected." Days later, the confirmation came. Greg Collins had been located overseas, a non-extradition country, new identity documents already in progress. The stolen funds traced just far enough to confirm intent, not far enough to retrieve them quickly. Detective Miller laid out the options when she met Rick in person. Civil recovery, international coordination, depositions, his name, his testimony, his time. "You'd be central," she said. "If you want to pursue this." Rick listened carefully, weighing the offer not as a strategist, but as a man who finally understood the cost of pursuit. "I won't," he said. Karen studied him. "You're sure?" Rick nodded. "Greg fleeing doesn't reopen my responsibility. It ends it." The decision surprised even Megan. "You're just letting him get away?" she asked later, disbelief mixed with desperation. "After everything?" Rick met her eyes steadily. "I'm letting myself go," he said. "That's the difference." Megan struggled with that answer. She wanted action, closure, a villain punished in a way that felt proportional to the damage done. Rick understood the instinct. He refused it anyway. Greg was gone. Chasing him would only tether Rick to a man who had already taken too much. Time, energy, identity. That night, Megan sat alone in her apartment, the silence no longer cushioned by illusion. For the first time, there was no one to blame but herself, and no one left to hide behind. Rick didn't rush to fill that space. He answered her calls when she came apart. He listened. But he did not step in front of the consequences anymore. Megan would have to learn how to stand without leaning on borrowed strength. And, slowly, painfully, she began to. Rick felt the final tie loosen not with force, but with clarity. Greg was no longer a threat, no longer a presence, no longer a shadow looming at the edge of Rick's life. He was a closed chapter, unfinished, legally perhaps, but complete emotionally. On a quiet evening, Rick stood on his balcony, the city stretching out beneath him, steady and indifferent. He felt no triumph, no bitterness, only relief. The final cut had been made not with anger, not with vengeance, but with refusal. Rick had chosen not to follow Greg into exile, and in doing so, he had finally severed the last chain binding his past to his future. The paperwork arrived quietly, without ceremony. Rick reviewed it at his desk one morning, sunlight cutting across the pages as if to separate past from present. Assets tied to Greg, what remained of them, were being liquidated. Properties sold under court supervision. Accounts drained not by theft this time, but by consequence. The numbers were smaller than they once had been, but they were real. Final. Rick signed, where required, his hand steady. There was no satisfaction in watching the dismantling, only a sense of completion, like finishing a sentence that had dragged on far too long. Megan called later that day. "I filed," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. The divorce. Rick closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of that word. Divorce wasn't failure. It was recognition. I think I waited too long," Megan added. "I kept hoping he'd come back, or explain, or apologize." Rick didn't interrupt. "But he didn't," she said. "And I finally understood that silence was the answer." Rick felt a quiet ache move through him. Not grief for Greg, but for the years Megan had lost waiting for someone who never intended to return. "I can help you find an attorney," Rick said gently, "or someone to walk you through the process." She hesitated. "I don't want money, Dad," Rick nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Then you'll have my time," he said, "and my honesty." That was the line he held. Rick offered emotional support, not financial rescue. He listened when Megan unraveled. He spoke when she asked. He didn't shield her from discomfort, and he didn't abandon her to it either. The balance was fragile, but it was real. Olivia handled the news differently. She showed up smiling, lighter than Rick had seen her in years. "It's finally over," she said, opening a bottle of wine in his kitchen. All of it. The waiting, the tension, the feeling that everything could explode at any moment. She raised her glass. "To freedom!" Rick smiled and clinked his glass against hers. "You were right," Olivia said later, as they sat on the balcony watching the evening settle in. "About redefining family. About choosing peace." Rick looked at his daughter, strong, grounded, unburdened by illusions she'd never agreed to carry. "You didn't need me to learn that," he said. "No," Olivia replied. "But I needed you to live it." They planned a trip not long after. Nothing extravagant. A quiet coastal town Rick had once visited with his wife decades earlier. He hadn't returned since. The air there smelled like salt and memory. They walked along the shore in the early mornings, spoke about nothing and everything. Olivia laughed easily. Rick found himself laughing too real laughter. Unguarded, joy returned not as a rush, but as a steady presence. One evening, sitting by the water, Olivia turned to him. "You don't seem angry anymore." Rick considered that. "I'm not," he said. "Anger did its job. It got me out. It doesn't need to stay." On the last day of the trip, Rick stood alone on the beach for a moment, shoes in hand, the tide brushing his feet. He felt whole not because everything had been repaired, but because nothing inside him was fractured anymore. He had faced betrayal without becoming bitter, loss without collapsing, power without abusing it. When he returned home, Megan left a message thanking him. Not apologizing, not asking, just acknowledging. Rick didn't rush to respond. He didn't need to. Closure, he understood now, wasn't about tying every loose end. It was about knowing which ones no longer belonged to you. As night fell, Rick sat quietly, the city beyond his window calm and ordinary. For the first time in years, there was nothing pressing on his chest. No unfinished reckoning. No silent dread. Just presence. Rick breathed deeply, feeling settled in his own life again, complete not because the past had been erased, but because it no longer defined him. And whatever came next, he would meet it whole. The invitation came without ceremony. A simple message from Megan, sent late in the evening when defenses were usually down. "I'm having a small gathering this weekend. Just family. I'd like you to come, if you're willing." Rick read it twice, then set the phone down. He didn't answer right away. Returning wasn't about geography. It was about power, who he would be in that space now, and who they expected him to be. The old house still carried echoes, ultimatums, silence. The moment he'd packed a suitcase and walked away with his dignity intact, Rick took a long walk the next morning, letting the decision breathe. He wasn't afraid of going back. He was cautious of going back unchanged. Megan called that afternoon. "I want to be clear," she said, her voice steady but careful. "This isn't about pretending nothing happened. I want us in the same room again. Honestly." Rick appreciated the word. "I won't come back to be managed," he said, "or diminished." "I know," Megan replied quietly. "That's not what I'm asking anymore." They talked longer than they had in years. No raised voices, no defensiveness. Megan spoke about the loneliness after Greg disappeared, about how silence had forced her to finally hear herself. Rick spoke about rebuilding, about learning when to step back instead of stepping in. When the call ended, Rick felt something unfamiliar. Readiness. Olivia called later, excitement barely contained. "I'm proud of you," she said. "No matter what you decide." Rick smiled. "For hesitating? For choosing consciously?" she replied. "That's new." The day of the gathering arrived with clear skies and quiet anticipation. Rick drove to the house slowly, noting how little the neighborhood had changed and how much he had. When he stepped inside, the space felt different, not because the furniture had moved, but because the rules had. Megan greeted him at the door. No tension, no performance, just a brief, genuine embrace. "Thank you for coming," she said. Rick nodded. "Thank you for asking." The gathering was small, exactly as promised. Olivia was there, relaxed and smiling. A few extended family members. No Greg-shaped absence hanging in the air, just the reality of who remained. Conversation flowed carefully at first, then more easily. Rick noticed something subtle but important. No one talked over him. No one corrected him. When he spoke, people listened not out of obligation, but respect. At one point, Megan raised a glass. "I want to say something," she began, her voice steady. Not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge them. Rick met her eyes, giving a small nod. "I didn't understand what I was asking you to give up," Megan continued, "and I won't ask that again." Silence followed, not awkward, but full. Olivia reached for Rick's hand under the table and squeezed it. "You did the hardest thing," she whispered. "You didn't break. You changed." Rick felt the weight of that land gently, not as praise, but recognition. Later, as the evening softened into laughter and shared stories, Rick allowed himself to settle into the moment. He wasn't reclaiming his place. He was redefining it. When he finally stood to leave, Megan walked him to the door. "I don't expect things to be perfect," she said. "I just want them to be real." Rick considered that. "Real requires consistency," he said. "We'll take it slowly." She nodded. "I'm ready for that." Driving away, Rick felt something align inside him. Not closure, he'd already had that. This was evolution. Mutual respect hadn't been demanded or negotiated. It had been earned. As the house receded in his rearview mirror, Rick didn't feel the pull of the past. He felt the calm of something beginning, not a return to what was, but a step into what could be. A new dawn didn't erase the night. It proved he'd survived it. They walked without a destination. Megan had suggested it casually. No agenda, no heavy conversation promised. Just a walk through the park near her place. The kind of neutral ground where no one held advantage. Rick agreed. Not because he expected resolution, but because he trusted the quiet now. The path curved gently beneath tall trees. Late afternoon light filtering through leaves that were just beginning to turn. Their steps fell into rhythm side by side. Not too close, not distant either. For a while, neither of them spoke. Rick didn't rush to fill the space. He had learned that silence, when mutual, could be an offering. Megan broke it first. "I used to think strength meant control," she said, eyes forward. "Having everything look right. Having everyone fall in line. Rick nodded slowly. That's a common mistake. I thought you were weak, she admitted, the words catching slightly. Because you didn't fight. Because you didn't demand. Rick stopped walking. Megan halted beside him, turning fully now, bracing herself. I wasn't weak, Rick said evenly. I was choosing restraint. There's a difference. She swallowed. I see that now. They resumed walking. I'm proud of you, Megan said quietly. For not becoming what would have been easier. Rick felt the weight of that sentence settle into his chest, not heavy, not sharp. Earned. Thank you, he said. That matters. They walked a few more steps before Megan spoke again. I regret how I treated you. Not just the ultimatum. All of it. I treated your presence like it was optional. Rick exhaled slowly. Regret acknowledged wasn't forgiveness, but it was the beginning of honesty. I regret staying silent when I should have spoken, Rick replied, and speaking only through money instead of presence. Megan looked at him then, surprised. I didn't expect you to say that. I'm not interested in being right anymore, Rick said. I'm interested in being real. They reached a bench overlooking a small pond. The sun hovered low, turning the water copper. They sat, shoulders angled slightly toward each other, watching light ripple and fade. I need to say something clearly, Rick said, so there's no confusion going forward. Megan nodded. I won't manage your life, he continued. I won't absorb consequences that aren't mine. And I won't be positioned beneath anyone again. Not emotionally. Not practically. Megan didn't flinch. That's fair, but, Rick added, I will be present, honest, consistent, if you meet me there. Megan's eyes filled, not with tears, but with relief. I want that, she said. I don't want to go back. I want to grow up from here. Rick studied her face, the familiar features now marked by experience rather than entitlement. Then we walk forward, he said, not backward. They sat in silence as the sun dipped lower, the air cooling around them. No phones, no urgency, just the sound of distant voices, birds settling in, the world continuing without demand. Silence healed in a way arguments never could. When they stood to leave, Megan hesitated. I don't expect you to trust me fully yet. Rick offered a small smile. Trust isn't a switch, he said. It's a pattern. She nodded. Then I'll show you. They walked back together as the sky darkened, the path lit now by soft lamps, flickering on one by one. Rick felt something steady inside him, not hope, not caution, alignment. At the edge of the park, they stopped. I'm glad you didn't give up on yourself, Megan said. Rick met her gaze. That's what made this possible. As they parted, Rick didn't feel the old pull to fix, to guide, to overfunction. He felt something better, partnership. He walked to his car alone, the sky now streaked with the last colors of day, and understood that moving forward didn't require forgetting the past. It required learning from it. And for the first time, both of them were ready to do exactly that. Rick hadn't expected the invitation. It arrived by mail, formal and understated, requesting his presence at a local civic forum, an annual gathering that honored professionals who had contributed quietly, consistently, without spectacle. His name was listed among them. No explanation. No footnotes about scandal or recovery. Just recognition. Rick considered declining. Old instincts told him to stay private, to avoid rooms where narratives could be reshaped without consent. But this time, he accepted not out of obligation, but curiosity. He wanted to see what remained when the noise was gone. The venue was modest, a community hall filled with people who looked him in the eye when they shook his hand. Former colleagues, business owners, neighbors who had followed the headlines and waited for the truth to settle before forming opinions. When Rick's name was called, the applause was steady, not loud, not performative. Earned. The citation spoke of integrity under pressure, of stewardship, of choosing accountability when silence would have been easier. No mention of Greg, no reference to betrayal. Rick stood at the podium briefly, thanked them, and said only this: character isn't proven when things are stable. It's revealed when they aren't. He stepped down without waiting for more. Afterward, people approached him not with questions, but with respect. Conversations weren't about what had been taken from him, but what he'd preserved. Rick felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not pride, exactly. Restoration. Megan stood nearby, watching it all unfold. She didn't hover. She didn't manage introductions. When someone congratulated Rick, she smiled and let the moment belong to him. "I'm glad they see you," she said quietly as they stood together near the back of the room. Rick looked at her. "I'm glad you do." There was no tension in her reply. No defensiveness. Just agreement. Olivia joined them later, energized as always, already talking about the future. "I'm thinking of changing fields," she said. "Something that actually aligns with who I am, not just what looks right." Rick listened, offering perspective without direction. He had learned when to advise and when to trust. "You're choosing consciously," he said. "That's enough." As the evening wound down, Rick stepped outside into the cool air, the city calm around him. He felt settled in a way he hadn't before, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing inside him was unresolved. The past no longer pulled at him. It had weight once. Real weight. But now it felt distant, like a chapter he could reference without being dragged back into its margins. The betrayal, the loss, the anger, they had done their work. What remained was strength. Not loud, not brittle, enduring. Later that night, Rick sat alone in his condo, the award plaque resting unopened on the table. He didn't need to display it. The recognition wasn't the object, it was the return of reputation, of self-respect, of balance. He thought about the man he had been when he packed a single suitcase and walked out of his own house. How controlled the pain had been. How deliberate the silence. That man hadn't known how this would end. This one did. Rick felt contentment settle in, not excitement, not relief, but a steady, grounding calm. He wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. He wasn't bracing. He was present. Megan sent a message before bed. "Proud of you," Rick replied simply. "Thank you for standing with me." He turned off the light and stood by the window for a moment, city lights stretching out like constellations, each one steady, unremarkable, enduring. The past had lost its grip. What Rick had reclaimed wasn't status or control. It was authorship. And as he prepared to step into whatever came next, Rick knew one thing with certainty. Strength didn't need to announce itself. It lasted. And it always would. The letter arrived without warning. No return address. Foreign stamps. Rick recognized the handwriting immediately, not because it was familiar, but because it tried too hard to be. Careful. Controlled. Greg's. Rick didn't open it right away. He set it on the kitchen counter and made coffee first, moving through the small, familiar rituals of his morning. The city outside his window was quiet, unremarkable, alive. When he finally broke the seal, there was no tension in his hands, just curiosity. Greg's words unfolded exactly as Rick expected. Apologies without ownership, reflection without accountability, long explanations that framed betrayal as misunderstanding, escape as necessity, and abandonment as inevitability. Greg wrote about fear, about pressure, about how everything had spiraled beyond his control. And buried beneath it all, subtle, practiced, unmistakable, was the request. Forgiveness implied. Sympathy invited. A door cracked open just enough for Greg to imagine he might still matter. Rick read the letter once. Then he folded it neatly and placed it back in the envelope. He felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, not even disappointment. The manipulation was so familiar, it barely registered. Greg was still trying to negotiate relevance from a distance, still mistaking words for consequence. Rick didn't respond. He didn't need to. That evening, the family gathered at Rick's condo. Nothing formal, no agenda. Just dinner, shared easily. Olivia arrived first, energetic as ever, bringing laughter with her. Megan followed, quieter, more reflective, but present in a way that no longer felt performative. There was no fear in the room, no tension waiting to be triggered by the wrong phrase or look. The past sat where it belonged, outside the circle. They ate slowly, talked about ordinary things. Olivia spoke about future plans, possibilities that felt open instead of pressured. Megan listened more than she spoke, absorbing rather than steering. At one point, Olivia turned to Rick. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Rick asked. "For standing firm," she replied. "Even when it cost you. You showed us what strength actually looks like." Rick nodded, the words landing quietly but deeply. Megan didn't say anything. She didn't have to. When Rick looked at her, she met his eyes and held them. No apology, no explanation, just acknowledgement. Respect. Finally unspoken, but unmistakable. That was enough. After dinner, as the night settled in, Rick walked them to the door. When he returned to the quiet of his home, he picked up Greg's letter one last time. He didn't tear it up. He didn't save it. He placed it in a drawer with other closed chapters, documents that no longer required attention, memories that no longer demanded processing. Greg had written his final move. Rick had already finished the game. Later, Rick stepped outside and walked through the neighborhood, hands in his pockets, breath steady. The streetlights cast long shadows, stretching forward, not back. He thought briefly of the man he'd been when this story began, standing in his own house, absorbing an ultimatum delivered by his daughter, silently packing a suitcase while others assumed he was finished. They had been wrong. He hadn't fought loudly. He hadn't demanded power. He had outlasted them. Rick didn't look back as he walked on. There was nothing behind him that still had claim. What remained was not revenge, not victory, not dominance, but something far rarer: endurance. The man they tried to discard had not only survived, he had defined the terms of what came next. And as Rick moved forward into the night, steady and unburdened, one truth stood unchallenged. Strength didn't need the last word. It only needed time. And Rick had plenty of it.